To the final lecture in the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics series on the question of institutional corruption. And for the last time, I can say I am Lawrence Lessig, director of the center, and very happy to welcome Simon Johnson to Harvard to speak about Sloan School of Management. He received his PhD from MIT and is a graduate of the University of Manchester and the University of Oxford. He's currently a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, a co-founder of Baseline Scenario, and a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors. It's been impossible in the past few months to open a newspaper or a news source on the web without reading Professor Johnson's views about the current financial crisis and the appropriate way to respond to it, or perhaps I shouldn't say impossible, because apparently a number of people within the administration have not yet opened those stories and read this analysis. But these recommendations grow out of an extraordinary book that Professor Johnson and his co-author James Kwok have just published, 13 Bankers. I strongly recommend this book to anybody who asks about this subject. And it's the story in this book that so clearly frames the issue of financial regulation within the context of these lectures. For as Johnson and Kwok describe, it was not just the influences of campaign funding that drove our Congress to a crazy, that's a technical legal term, regulatory or non-regulatory strategy for the financial services sector. It was also a background set of cultural ideals, some of them emanating from some on this very campus, ideals that erected deregulation as an obvious solution to the policy problems of financial regulation, which set the conditions for the perfect storm that is the financial crisis within which we all still live. This complex set of influences certainly had the effect of weakening the effectiveness of the institutions of policymaking and financial services companies, and the disaster we have just passed through certainly has had the effect of weakening public trust in those institutions. I suspect it's not a happy story that Professor Johnson will tell today about how we've learned our lesson, reformed ourselves, and are moving on. I suspect instead it's a story about how much more we have to learn. So I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Johnson to Harvard to help us learn again the lessons that so many thought we had learned many generations ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry, for the invitation. Thanks for turning up today, everyone. And it's truly a great pleasure to be here. Oh, and thanks, Larry, also for one of the best blurbs we got on our book, just in the interest of full disclosure. Larry's actually the top one on our website. And I would like to recognize my co-author, James, who came in for Larry's speaking, sitting at the back. He will be taking the hard questions later. I have a book. You heard about that. I'm on a book tour. But I'm not actually here to try and get you to go buy the book. There are, I just happen to know, only 23 of them left in another bookstore. And some of those are signed and some of them aren't, so if you rush over, they don't get one. But seriously. And I also gave a talk at MIT just now to a very senior, distinguished group of MIT emeritus professors, and they actually said to me, "You have a book?" So I was a little disappointed by that. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. That's not what I want you to do after this. I have actually a very simple deliverable, which is exactly on the message, the title of the talk, Wall Street of Washington, and I think right down the middle of the theme of this lecture series, which is institutional corruption, and I would assume the subtitle for everyone who attends such lectures is, and what the heck do we do about it? I predicted that people would shout at me if I didn't have the mic on, but that didn't work. So I have a very simple thing for you to do, a very simple way to address this issue if you're concerned about it. In the context of the United States today, it is absolutely doable. In fact, to be honest, you are among the most important set of Americans for me to talk to on this issue. Because you have a certain senator who could go either way on this. I think you know what I'm talking about. But here's the key thing to do. Okay? If you're interested, if you find this at all plausible, you can look at the book more. If you've got a few dollars to spare, if you want the free version, we have a website, Baseline Scenario. You can look at, basically all of these ideas in blog format. and the backstory and more explanation, if you prefer the written word, I would like you, after this talk, to go and call your senator, call Senator Harry Reid, who's the majority leader in the Senate, and call the president. Now, I don't think you will get through to those people. Ed may, but probably most of us won't. Ed Blaze, another one of my calls this year. I will be citing some of our joint work as I go through the evening. And you should say to them, you're strongly in favor of the amendment, the bill, which could become an amendment proposed by Senator Brown and Senator Kaufman. You want that bill to be brought to the Senate floor and to be subject to an up or down vote. That bill proposes, I think appropriately and very strongly, that the largest banks in this country should be subject to a size cap and other restrictions on what they can do. This is a key piece that's missing from Senator Dodd's legislation. Senator Dodd has a financial reform bill that I think will come to the Senate on Monday, although they do need one Republican to vote with them to bring it to the floor. And you might also mention that when you call your Senator Brown. The Senator Brown who has the sensible, strong reform proposal is not your Senator Brown, just to be clear. Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio. Your Senator Brown is not clear where he's going to go on this. I think that this is really an incredible opportunity for us and for you, right, to speak out and to deal with this issue. And I'd like to spend the next 88 minutes or so explaining why, and then we'll do question and answer and see if I can persuade you to make those phone calls. You know, there is a good reason to write a book on these issues. A very good reason to write a book. And this is, you know, as Larry said, we do lots of things online, lots of op-eds, plenty of media appearances. But there's one thing that you need a book to do. And that's that. Okay? You cannot pound the table with a blog post. I've tried. We have a book on these issues. We have a book about where we are today, how we got here, and this is a very important backstory, I think, to understand the issues and what needs to be done. And we have some very concrete, specific proposals, which are very much on the table. This is from an interview that Senator Dodd, so he's the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Dodd gave to Ezra Klein, and it's on Ezra Klein's website, the Washington Post today. Chris Dodd says, I've looked at the 13 Bankers book and so forth, that approach, and I hear this, by the way, not just from them, that's us, but from CEOs of major corporations, which is true. Actually, it's a CEO of a major non-financial corporation gave this book to Senator Dodd, I'm told. This is not some left-right question. I'm reading Senator Dodd again, absolutely right. But I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. I don't think it will prevail. Well, we'll see. I think this is the issue of the day and the issue of the week. And probably not more than 1 week, actually. I think this debate comes to a head very sharply. So where are we? How dramatic is this? You know, am I overdoing it? Is the book a little the Wall Street takeover and the next financial meltdown? Well, let me cite something else. Some other words. Some other words that came today. Both bills. I'm quoting here. Both bills. This is talking about the House Financial Reform Bill and the Senate Reform Bill. Both bills represent significant improvement on the flawed rules we have in place today, despite the furious efforts of industry lobbyists to shape them to their special interests. Good words, good language, very much in line with what we've got here. This is President Obama at Cooper Union at noon today. He also said, reckless practices were rampant. And he also said, and while it's true that many Americans took on financial obligations they knew or should have known they could not afford, millions of others were, frankly, duped. They were misled by deceptive terms and conditions buried deep in the fine print. This is exactly what we've been saying. We've been saying on our website for a long time, what we say in the book, that the financial sector became very dangerous. Now, how dangerous is a key issue. Secretary of the Treasury Tim Geithner says, sometimes, I haven't checked with him today, but he sometimes says it was a 40-year flood. A rare event, a series of accidents, perhaps, and you shouldn't overreact to 40-year floods, because you'll regret it between years 1 and 39. Now, that's absolutely not our view. I mean, our view is, yes, this was a 40-year awful crisis. I think actually the worst, I think we agree, worst financial crisis since World War II. That's the language the president uses. Everyone I've heard speak on this uses that language. But we argue that it was as bad in its effects, not because of the 40-year combination of rare events that won't come again for another 40 years, but rather because we weakened the levees. The levees declined. The levees that protected us, as Larry said, the financial regulation that was there for a reason, decayed, was not updated, did not keep up with financial innovation, ways I'll talk about. And that's what led to this awful experience. So if we weaken the levees over, I don't know if it's 40 years or we actually argue more like 30 years, then we're still vulnerable. We haven't fixed it. 13 bankers came to the White House last March. The financial system was in deep trouble. The financial system obviously had to be saved. You can't run this economy without credit. But the 13 bankers, these are the CEOs of the biggest banks in the country, were saved completely and unconditionally at that meeting and in the subsequent 2 months, the developments that played out. Their jobs were saved, their bonuses were saved, their pensions were saved, their boards of directors were not touched, which is absolutely extraordinary, given what they presided over. Their entire belief system remains intact. Their incentive structure, the way they compensate themselves and the people who work for them is the same. John Stumpf, the CEO of Wells Fargo, got a very big cash payout for 2009. Cash. Directly contrary to what the administration has requested and even required where it had the legal opportunity in terms of how you compensate CEOs. And when Wells Fargo was asked why was Mr. Stumpf paid so much cash, the response was, we had a very good year in 2009. Well, I'm sorry, they did not have a very good year in 2009. They and the other big banks were saved by the American taxpayer and by the government in 2009. Now, we can debate. We take a position in the book, a position that's controversial and that's disputed by senior people in the administration in terms of what the options were last spring. Senior people in the administration talk to us about this. They take this seriously. And they say, Simon, we had no alternative. We had to save them in that fashion. If we had done it any other way, that would have worsened the crisis and deepened the recession. Well, I don't accept that view either, and that's one reason we wrote the book. But just take that view, take it at face value for a moment, okay? What does that imply about the power that these banks have, right? So it's not just that they can act with a certain attitude towards the SEC. That's the example of Goldman Sachs and its political strategy you've seen over the past few days. It's not just they can act as they've done relative to their customers. Again, the Goldman Sachs case has some pretty painful details if the SEC allegations turn out to be true. But it's also if you push them, either in a systemic situation or actually from the point of view of sensibly and legitimately pursuing them through the courts, they have a power, they claim, and I think with good basis, based on what we have in the book, to threaten you and the economy and the political system. Mr. Lloyd Blankfein said today, according to the Financial Times, that the consequences of the SEC case against Goldman would be, and the word I remember is horrible. Somebody else said to me that the word was actually very bad for the American economy. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. I was talking with my colleague Peter Temin at MIT at lunchtime, and he and I had exactly the same same reaction to this statement. Both of us felt it was exactly the same. It was a modern version of the wording and the body language that Nicholas Biddle used to react to Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill for a reason. He was a key figure in the formation of American politics and the American economy. And he felt in the early 1830s that the second bank of the United States had become too powerful. And he decided to take it on in various ways. Now, he was not, by the way, the first president to worry about this. Thomas Jefferson preceded him on these issues, but Jackson was the person who really faced this confrontation. And initially, people thought Jackson was crazy. They thought he was exaggerating. They thought he had lead poisoning from a bullet he'd taken in the Indian Wars or something, they claimed. But then Nicholas Biddle started to fight back. Biddle started to buy congressional votes and public orators like Daniel Webster rather freely. And then Biddle said, I'll show Jackson that we're so powerful that he can't do this to us by contracting credit in the economy. Now, historians argue about whether or not he did actually have that power and whether that contraction of credit was significant. There's no question that was his intent. And Peter Temin is, among other things, one of the leading, probably the leading living economic historian on the Jacksonian economy. And that was well timed, James. Could you do that again? So we have faced this before. We are in a very serious situation. At least 3 times, to our reckoning, the American Republic has faced a confrontation with concentrated financial power. It was Jackson in the 1830s, Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s, and FDR in the 1930s. And I'll come back to those later episodes. I think we had the idea, prior to 2008 or prior to 2007, myself, that the US had moved on, that we'd progressed, and we had improved our institutions. And certainly I've written papers that had this implication. And a lot of my work was actually about comparing the United States with other places. And the paper I did with Ed that I referred to earlier was also with Andrei Schleifer, where we looked at Poland and the Czech Republic, were our primary comparison cases, and looked at how they'd handled the 1990s and the aftermath of communism. And it struck us that the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and then the Czech Republic had gone too far down the road of unregulation, not even deregulation. They didn't have any to start with. And Václav Klaus was a sort of leading proponent of that. More Chicago than the Chicago School, if you like. More Cosian than Cos is what is our line. And Poland, in contrast, had been much more cautious, more regulatory, more restrictive, and had actually had developed sensible capital markets and had not let unscrupulous operators, one of whom actually ran a fund called Harvard Capital, if I remember. Nothing to do with Harvard at all, absolutely. About identity theft, which is another matter I'll come back to later. A fascinating episode. But I think, at least speaking for myself, and Ed can speak for himself, my view looking at the history until recently was that the US institutions were not perfect, but they had improved and they were better than what we saw elsewhere. And I think we can still discuss whether or not they're better. But I think I would insist much more now that if they are better and if they remain better, it's only through these repeated episodes of repeated confrontation with concentrated economic power. And this is extremely dangerous. This is one of the most dangerous episodes, I think, that we've seen. As manifest by the crisis of September 2008, the fact that these banks almost collapsed, the fact that they were saved on incredibly generous terms, the fact that at least the people in power today, I absolutely assure you, and I talked to them last week on this very specific question, they still feel that they can't ruffle these feathers. Now, the SEC has taken a slightly different course. SEC, of course, is an independent agency. We have no idea of the political... I suspect there isn't a political connection behind that. But we have no way of knowing that. So, we have reached a moment of confrontation. Now, I do think that we will win. I actually think that the history and the regressions and this cross-country analysis encourages me that the US will come through this. All right? I think we have a very robust democracy. I know we have faced this before, but it is extremely serious. Now, when Larry asked me to speak in this series, I have to say, first of all, I was delighted to have the invitation. Secondly, I was deeply worried because the issue of ethics and whether this is an ethical question, as in breach of ethics, as in people did unethical things, is something that we go back and forth, James and I go back and forth on frequently. I mean, the point we insist on is it's a system of incentives and beliefs that has become dangerous. Now, within that, we can certainly discuss, and it's a very interesting question, the role of unethical activities, such as what the SEC alleges that Goldman did. And believe me, I am completely open to that possibility. But I also think that's not essential to the argument. I actually think that many bankers, including one of my favorite bankers, or at least I talk about him a lot, Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase. Jamie Dimon is very good at his job. Jamie Dimon's job, as far as I know, I haven't seen his job description, but as far as I know, there is nothing in his job description that says he is responsible for financial stability either in the United States or around the world. I think, makes sense, his job is to make money for his shareholders and for his colleagues at JP Morgan Chase. Now, sometimes people interpret what we say in our messages as being from the left of the political spectrum. And certainly we have many allies on the left, and some of our views may be more on the left. But I would also say, and I was in Chicago recently, actually, and I gave this talk, a big public lecture, that there were plenty of people there from the University of Chicago, faculty and students. And I said, at least to me, one of the giants on whose shoulders we stand in this book and in our approach is George Stigler, who I don't think anyone ever accused Stigler of being from the left of the political spectrum. Stigler, of course, advanced the argument in compelling detail that any industry that is regulated will capture its regulators. It's a very powerful argument. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest it. And I think that's exactly what happened also after the 1970s with regard to regulation, both narrowly and very broadly defined in terms of legislation on the financial sector. But there's also a concept that is built on Stigler, which has been widely applied, but mostly to other countries, honestly, certainly within the mainstream of economics, which is state capture. So when an industry or a particular set of interests is so powerful, they get control over the government, that's state capture, and that leads to very bad outcomes, including macroeconomic outcomes. Actually, that's some other work I've done with Ron A and Jim Robinson, Ron of MIT and Jim of Harvard. So, I think that the situation we face today is very difficult. It's very much about imbalance of power and about how strong these banks have become. It's very much about regulatory capture on a grand scale. And it's very much about the dangerous economic and political consequences of this kind of capture, such as financial crisis. So I've worked on financial crisis for a long time. In fact, I usually tell people accurately that that's my main specialization within economics. It's not a field per se, but that's where I do most of my work. And a lot of the issues that we cover here and that we apply to the United States are things that we've seen in other countries, like Russia, Argentina, Korea, Mexico. And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the United States is just like those countries. Right? There are important and profound differences, at least for the time being. But we've picked up some features of those countries, or we're closer to them than we'd like to think. And at least in my reading of President Obama's speech today, it's a good speech. And it's a much stronger speech than ones he's given in the past. And he doesn't call Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, savvy businessmen, which is a big improvement. So how do we get here, and what are we going to do about it? It's a serious crisis. It's a political crisis, as well as an economic crisis to come, the next financial meltdown. It may sound a little sensational, but I take that very seriously. How do we get here exactly? What is the backstory? Well, I think Larry actually gave a good summary of it, a very succinct summary. I'll have to borrow that for the next time I give a talk, Larry, and use that in my introduction. Basically, we had a regulated financial system that came out of the 1930s. Those regulations began to break down in the 1970s, partly because the economy changed, partly because of inflation. And instead of coming up with a vision of re-regulating, there was a growing consensus that we should deregulate. Now, this obviously fit in with the Reagan Revolution and a broader view of deregulation, the need for deregulation, not just in the United States, but also in other industrialized countries. And I would emphasize that I'm not against deregulation in general. I think in some parts of the economy, deregulation was sensible. I personally greatly like cheap airfare, which came out of deregulation. But deregulation applied to finance is different and can create in other countries, and has created in this country, a dangerous situation. Now, in that history, it's important to emphasize that some of this started under President Carter,
Actually, it's very interesting. People who are strong proponents of Ronald Reagan have approached me on this, and they do not say Ronald Reagan did the right thing. They say Jimmy Carter started it. It's an interesting reaction. And we also point out and emphasize in the book that many of the ideas that Ronald Reagan wanted to pursue with regard to deregulation in finance were actually blocked by the Democratic Congress. So in the 1980s, there was not as much movement towards deregulation as you might think if you didn't go back and check all the details. The 1980s were important. I'll come on to that in a moment. But more as a marker of the beginning. The real change, the big movement happened in the 1990s. And it happened when what I would call the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party became ascendant, which was when Rubin became Secretary of the Treasury. And there were other personnel shifts after the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. Now, it's also interesting to note that Mr. Rubin insists, and has been saying it publicly, for example, over the last week, that he has always, throughout his entire career, favored strong regulation for derivatives. Now, I must admit, when I first heard him say, he said this at a meeting to one of my colleagues at the Huffington Post, where I work in my spare time. He said this on Tuesday, and I had three reactions to Robert Rubin's statement. First of all, I spent a good amount of time laughing. Second, but it's an implausible claim. Rubin was there, he was in charge, he was the boss. He can perhaps claim that when he was later on the board of directors of Citigroup, that he didn't know what was going on and he wasn't responsible. It is much harder for the Secretary of the Treasury to say that about statements made by undersecretaries to Congress. Okay, that's his job, that's his responsibility. Sorry, Mr. Rubin. Is he still on the Board of Overseers of Harvard? Okay. With all due respect, sorry, Mr. Rubin. And secondly, I thought, well, really, who cares about what Mr. Rubin thinks? Because he really is a very discredited figure, I would suggest, in American political life. But then I thought, wait a minute, maybe we should build him up again. Because if even Robert Rubin is insisting on the need to regulate derivatives, the ideology of finance has really lost. And I think this is a key point. And this is really what happened in the 80s, and definitely in the 1990s. And this was also my slight hesitation on Larry's, the title of the lecture series, Institutional Corruption. Well, we're willing to concede or insist that there's corruption in some instances, corruption as in money corruption. And I'll come on to the money behind lobbying later, which we could certainly call corruption if you want. But we argue strongly that a very important part of what happened, and the mechanism, the main mechanism, the key mechanism of the Wall Street takeover of Washington was ideological. It was a belief system. Right? If you want politicians to do something in your favor, you can give them contributions, you can spend time lobbying them, you can, run all kinds of other political tactics. Or you can just persuade them and persuade the intellectual milieu around Washington that deregulation is good and unfettered finance is better. And that mega banks can run their own risk management systems, take a huge amount of risk, and there won't be any adverse social consequences. Now, all of those views are wrong, particularly the one about mega banks. I would emphasize, I am not telling you anything that I don't tell to the representatives of those big banks themselves. I had this discussion with Jerry Corrigan, who's the former head of the New York Fed. He's a long-time Goldman Sachs executive. He lives in Boston. I don't know if he's in the back of the room. Anyway, doesn't matter. We both appeared before the Senate Banking Committee in February of this year. And Jerry said, the risk management systems at Goldman Sachs are world-class. And I gave him a fairly hard time about that because it seems to me that Goldman Sachs, just as a matter of historical record, failed in September 2008 and was rescued at the last minute by being allowed to become a bank holding company. My interpretation of history. He disputed it, then he gave some ground. But can anyone say after at least I think the SEC allegation among the people I talked to, and the detail it provides has probably the final nail in the coffin of the idea that Goldman Sachs that Goldman Sachs risk management actually works. It may be world-class, but then world-class is not very good. Because think of the operational risks and think of the reputational risks they were taking on in that transaction, where they were basically, according to the SEC, misrepresenting to customers this financial product. We'll see. There's going to be some testimony next Tuesday, Lloyd Blankfein and maybe the fabulous Fabrice, I think he calls himself, will be testifying, so we'll learn more, and I'm all in favor of learning more. I don't want to prejudge it. But the idea that the mega banks know what they're doing, that they understand risk, they can manage risk, I think that idea is now long gone. I think the ideology of finance has been broken. It was very strong, and it was built up. Partly it was built on money, of course. It was built on fabulous amounts of money. And if you're going to read just one book on the financial crisis, you should read this book. But if you're going to read two, you should read Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker from the 1980s. It is brilliant. And it is brilliant for many reasons, one of which is everything he described. So he worked at Salomon Brothers, which was the hard-charging bond trading firm, and that actually innovated a lot of pieces of what became the broader, more dangerous financial innovation. It's okay. He said he was going to leave in advance. He's not offended. He was very careful. So Michael Lewis talks about what seems like excess, and he says, and I think I'm sure it's plausible. I'm sure that's how he sees it. That he wrote the book as a cautionary tale, and he also says that people saw it as a how-to manual, and students would write to him saying, "How do I get a job on Wall Street so I can eat guacamole from five-gallon tubs and stuff like that?" But the striking thing, and the thing that strikes us, the thing we wrote in our book, and actually Michael Lewis now makes the same points in his media appearances, is, I'm sure he got to this, I didn't get this from us, I'm sure this is his own view of his work, looking back more than 20 years, is that was so small scale. That was, John Gutfreund, who was the head of Salomon Brothers in the 80s, at one point appeared on the front cover of Business Week, and they called him the King of Wall Street. And as far as we can determine, at that moment, he had about 2,500 people working for him, which is a very small firm for Wall Street today. And in fact, our largest hedge funds in this country are now approaching 1,500 people. Right? The scale of resources that shifted into the financial sector since the 1980s is mind-boggling. Let me use a close-to-home piece of data. And I mention Harvard only because Harvard has good data on this. Other schools, as far as we've been able to ascertain, the pattern is broadly similar. About 10% of the graduating class undergraduates at Harvard in 1970 went into finance. The data are not exactly comparable, but roughly speaking, between 30 and 40% of the graduating class at the height of the subprime bubble went into finance. This is, where the talented people in your economy go is hugely important for economic outcomes and also for political outcomes, right? I mean, it's not just a very well-financed lobby, it's an incredibly smart lobby of really talented people who are not doing much that's productive in any broad or long-term sense. Financial intermediation is an intermediate product. You do not eat money, right? We want a good financial sector. We want an efficient financial sector in order to help us do non-financial things. Okay? I don't want to consume now. I want to save for my kids' college education. I want capital to be allocated effectively. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT. I can assure you I'm not anti-finance. And I can also assure you that entrepreneurs and venture capitalists get this. And we have blurbs from some leading people in the book. And that's obviously reflected in what Senator Dodd says. This is not left versus right. We have serious non-financial people on our side. The non-financial sector needs a well-functioning financial sector. But when you have a situation like we had in the early 2000s in this country, corporate profits coming from the financial sector were 40%. 40% of all corporate profits were in the financial sector. Now that was a very high year, but it's not a one-off. There was a big shift from the mid-1990s, from actually the arrival of derivatives in their modern form, from the growth of the associated complexity. And I think actually from the growth of market power, although that's very hard to document, we certainly know that the large broker-dealers have very big market share of over-the-counter derivatives now. And we think that these high profits reflect, in part, that market structure. People went into finance because that's where the money was. If you look at average compensation in finance, Prior to the 1930s, it was a very well-compensated sector. The average wage in finance was about 1.7, 1.8 times the average private sector wage. Finance, by the way, was a small sector. It was about 1 or 2% of GDP. It was highly compensated and very prestigious. The reforms of the 1930s reduced financial sector compensation relative to private sector averages. And in fact, in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, it was not a particularly high-paid job, on average, if you went into banking. Banking was not sexy. Banking was a little bit boring and dull. There was a so-called 3-6-3 model. Pay 3% on deposits, lend it out at 6%, and go play golf at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, it's not a bad lifestyle, particularly if you like golf. I don't think there are a lot of poor bankers. But it was not this exciting, high-risk-taking, multi-million-dollar payouts. You know, John Gutfreund got a good salary, got a good bonus in the 1980s. The money that he made in real terms is swamped, dwarfed by what the top people made, even in the boom. And of course, in 2008, as the crisis broke, they also got good compensation. In 2009, they also got good compensation. Right? They did. 2009 is the best year on record for Wall Street compensation. Okay? As far as they're concerned, there wasn't particularly a crisis. Jamie Dimon actually said to his shareholders in May of last year, we just had probably our best year ever. May 2009. Right? But he's right in terms of his compensation. I actually don't think his shareholders did that well. But this is what it was about. And so is it ethics? You know, is this, you know, should people stand back and say, I don't want to take the high-paying job at Goldman Sachs. I want to go work on developing whatever your favorite, you know, green technology. I can't answer that question. I don't think that's, I think, you know, it's a market economy. I think people graduating from college have debts. I think that bankers are doing their jobs. I think it's not the banker's responsibility to be well regulated. I think that's the responsibility of the political system and the regulators. Now, whether they should set out to deviously and completely capture the state is another matter. But I don't think this is a conspiracy. There's nothing in this book that says it's a conspiracy. The book is about the history. The book is about the system of beliefs and incentives that developed. I think conspiracies are relatively easy to root out, actually, in general. This is much harder. This is a way of thinking about the world that is now challenged, perhaps even shaken up. And we wrote the book to attack that further. And we wrote the book so that people can do this wherever tables are available around the United States. But there is still the money. Right? Even if I'm right, and you know, so I'm a somewhat optimistic, positive person. I'm an immigrant. It's not a put-on accent. It's a genuine. I've been here 25 years. I became a citizen. I thought long and hard about becoming a citizen. I read the Constitution. I took the test, and I did well on the test. Actually, I do well on the test. And I believe in this political system. I believe we can come out of this. But there is the money. There are the campaign contributions. And this is the issue right before us, is what do we do? What do I do? What can you do? What's your responsibility? What's your opportunity in this situation? Senator Dodd, so the administration made some proposals on financial reform back last summer. We felt they were too weak. We worked very hard on our website in various other ways to persuade them to strengthen those proposals. They strengthened the proposals, perhaps independently of us. I have no way of, I'm not claiming anything. But Paul Volcker certainly had a very important role to play, and they announced in January something they called the Volcker Rules, which were tighter restrictions on what banks can do in terms of so-called proprietary trading, and also a size cap on banks, at least moving forward. Cap banks at their current size. I mean, our reaction to that was, why would you cap them at their current size? The current size is very much part of the political power structure and the too big to fail issue that's brought us to this point. Too big to fail, by the way, is absolutely critical. I understand some people get confused about this and some people are trying to confuse you about this. I'll come on to that. But it's really very important. If the largest financial institution we let fail in 2009 was CIT Group, it had $80 billion in assets, 80. Goldman Sachs fluctuates around $800 billion. It was actually $1.1 trillion at the peak when everyone collapsed in 2008. There is no way that this administration would let Goldman Sachs fail right now. It's too big. If it were $80 billion, we could have the conversation. Maybe we'd find there are some other reasons, some other problems. I'm not at all saying that size is the only thing to worry about. We've never said that. Reducing the size of our largest banks is not sufficient for financial stability. It is, however, in our view, necessary. And it is a key piece that was missing from the original administration proposal. It was mentioned in principle in the Volcker rules. It's the second Volcker rule. Our view was, don't cap, and this is what I was called to testify to the Senate Banking Committee on the Volcker rules, sitting next to Mr. Corrigan. And I said, why would you cap them at their current size? You should cap them at a smaller size. And we emphasized, I wasn't able to do this. You can't do that to the Senate Banking Committee. There is no evidence of economies of scale or scope in banking or any other benefit to society from having a bank over $100 billion in total assets. None. Now, there may be evidence down the road. There are certainly claims made by bankers, I understand. There may be evidence down the road. I know there are research teams working on this question, admittedly funded by the big banks, so we'll evaluate that research when it comes. But there is no evidence. I present this, this I would claim is kind of peer-reviewed. It's true, I'm not willing to wait 3 years for the journals to determine this, but I go and talk about this to people like you, to lawyers, to finance specialists. I'll talk to any bankers who want to talk to me. We have an open website where you can post any comment you want as long as it isn't caught by one of WordPress's bad word screens. There is no evidence of value to society of having banks over $100 billion. Citigroup, when it failed, ran into liquidity difficulties. I always get confused. No, when it failed in fall 2008, Citigroup had a balance sheet, if you include all the off-balance sheet liabilities they had to bring back on, $2.5 trillion. Now, Senator Dodd says that he doesn't think size makes a lot of sense. Well, this is the question I have that I put to, what I put to Senator Dodd, what I put to his staffers when I saw them recently, what I put to anyone who wants to engage in this debate. Tell me this. Citigroup was $2.5 trillion when it failed. Would our problems today be better or worse if Citigroup had been $5 trillion? Okay. What if Citigroup were the size relative to the United States that the Royal Bank of Scotland was relative to the United Kingdom when it failed in 2008? Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, had a balance sheet of 1.5 times the size of the UK GDP. So let's call that, in the US for Citigroup, my hypothetical, $20 trillion. Would our problems be better or worse now? Or better or worse next time if Citi gets to $20 trillion? Hey, Simon, come on. That's excessive. That's extreme. Well, maybe. But Jamie Dimon he said in his letter to his shareholders a couple of weeks ago, if we're big, it's because we're good. And if we want to get big, that's a natural market process, and the government should not get in the way. That is incorrect. JP Morgan Chase has a big advantage, a big funding advantage in the markets because it is perceived by the markets as being too big to fail. I talked to credit analysts. I had breakfast in Los Angeles with some top bond market people last week. Okay? They think, with good justification, that JP Morgan Chase is safer than other banks. This gives JP Morgan and the other banks, called too big to fail banks, shorthand, a funding advantage of between, estimates are 70 and 80 basis points, 0.7 to 0.8 of a percentage point. That's a big advantage. That helps you get bigger. And I would say this to all my Republican colleagues and friends, and I have many, and some of them endorse the book, okay, and you can read the blurbs in the front. They insisted for a long time that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had become too big to fail and had distorted incentives and were taking too much risk, and this would jeopardize the system. And what I would say to all my Republican colleagues on that issue is, you were right. Fannie and Freddie did become dangerous. The incentives they had were inappropriate and dangerous to the economy and to the system. And that needs to be addressed going forward. We have to find a way to euthanize those structures and can actually change the way we finance mortgages in this country. But just take that same reasoning on too big to fail and look at our biggest banks, our biggest private banks today. Look at Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. Those banks together have assets to GDP about 63% of GDP. Before the crisis, the same banks were in the 56 to 58% range, and they got bigger because of the crisis. In the mid-1990s, the same banks together had assets around 17% of GDP. What have we gained as a society from the increase in the size of our largest banks? We've gained nothing. There is no evidence that we have gained anything. What are the costs we have incurred? Because the banks became so big, they could take on risks and mismanage themselves in a way that was manifest dramatically in September 2008. Well, I would submit 8 million jobs lost since December 2007. I would also submit, by the way, the huge fiscal costs that we've incurred. And on this point also, I felt the President was not completely clear in his speech today. The costs of this program, of what the government had to do, cannot be measured by the so-called TARP injection of capital and whether or not you got a return on that. That's one program, to be sure. And of course, it's an interesting question how to evaluate the resources committed by the Federal Reserve, which are actually off the balance sheet of the US federal government. But just focus on what the CBO focuses on, and as Larry says, I'm on one of their panels. These numbers are my numbers, not their numbers, but I have to say, as they revise their numbers, they come closer to my numbers. We started out with private sector holdings, net government debt, about 43% of GDP. We are on our way to the same number, net government debt held by the private sector, of 80% of GDP. We doubled our debt to GDP. For what? To save the day, actually, to put in a fiscal stimulus, and both through discretionary policy and through so-called automatic stabilizers, that I think was necessary, and I testified to Congress to that effect, and I supported the administration in doing it. But that's a huge cost. That does not turn the United States, does not create a Greece-type fiscal situation in the United States. But if you do it again, anytime this side of 40 years, you will become Greece. Why? Because there are 6 banks. 6 that are far too big, that are far too dangerous. And the Dodd bill, the legislation that's come through the House, the legislation is now likely to come to the Senate floor. They're still negotiating. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Dodd bill makes some steps in the right direction. But we've been arguing very hard for as long as this has been on the agenda to strengthen it. It has become somewhat stronger. But it should be strengthened further. And Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio and Senator Ted Kaufman of Delaware have proposed a bill that could become an amendment that is extremely sensible and reasonable. These are very responsible public servants, okay? These are not crazy radicals. They say we should impose a size cap on our largest banks. And they invoke, quite appropriately, the Regal-Neal Act of 1994, which does cap the size of our largest banks. No bank, this law still exists, no bank is allowed to have more than 10% of total retail deposits in the United States. 2 problems with that. First of all, the big growth in banks since 1994 has not been retail deposits. It's been wholesale financing, not covered by that law. Secondly, it turns out there are a number of loopholes in that law that compliant regulators could let you drive something as big as Bank of America through. So it didn't turn out to be very effective. We have to update and tighten and apply the Regal-Neal Act. It's already on the books. You have a cap. Say you've got 3 years to comply with the cap. It is your responsibility as a big bank to figure out how to do this. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to do that in such a way as maintains or promotes shareholder value. The breakup of Standard Oil in 1912 was a bonanza for the shareholders of Standard Oil. The created 35, 37 companies, you know, they made a lot of money on that. The breakup of AT&T in the 1980s was great for anyone who worked in the telecommunication industry. It was great for entrepreneurship. It was great for innovation. It was terrific for growth. Anybody here want to restore AT&T as a telecommunications monopoly? Anybody want to restore Standard Oil as an energy monopoly? Actually, last time I gave this talk, one guy raised his hand on the Standard Oil question, but he was from the energy sector. So, you know, concentrated economic power is a problem. It's a problem we've confronted repeatedly in this economy. And in 1902, in closing, let me say this. In 1902, when Teddy Roosevelt decided to take on Northern Securities, the big railroad trusts run by J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan came to see him in the White House, and he said, if we've done anything wrong, send your man to see my man, and we will fix it up. And Roosevelt and his Attorney General said, no, we don't want to fix it up, we want to stop it. And they took Northern Securities to the Supreme Court, and they won that case 5-4. And from that came modern antitrust. But the really big shift, the huge achievement of Theodore Roosevelt, was to change the consensus. In 1902, people like you, in an auditorium like this, at this very university, would have felt great puzzlement at what Roosevelt was doing. There was no theory, no antitrust theory, not in the mainstream, certainly. Nobody thought he could win. I mean, the Senate was called the Millionaires Club for a reason. The senators weren't directly elected, as you know. Nelson Aldrich, the arguably most senior heavyweight Republican of his day, senator, his daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller's son. Okay? This is how the country was run. And Roosevelt changed that. And by 1912, people like you, in an auditorium like this, on this campus or down the river or anywhere in the country, would have agreed that Standard Oil and other huge companies have become too big for the good of society. It's that thinking, that shifting consensus that we need to do again, and that's why we wrote the book, is to make that point. And we don't, this is not about this legislative cycle by itself. This cycle is important, this bill is important. The Brown-Kaufman Amendment is a fantastic opportunity. Put it on the floor of the Senate, have an up or down vote, cap the size of our largest banks. Are you for? Are you against? Are you with the big banks or are you against them? Wouldn't you like to know that when the time comes for the next elections in November or whenever your senator comes up for re-election? But it won't happen. Unless you make it happen. Unless you make, I mean, this was my reaction. This was the blog post I put out. This was in the Huffington Post top spread this afternoon. You know, either make a lot of you are upset about the financial sector. A lot of you are concerned about the ethics. A lot of you are not happy with what has happened in this country, and I respect that. And you can keep your reservation. You can just argue it out with me. You can keep your reservations about our economy and our system private if you want. But now is the time to either make the phone call or get out of the booth. You call your representative and tell them that the Brown-Kaufman bill should be brought to the floor of the Senate for an up or down vote. And that is your opinion. And you should call your senator and call Harry Reid and call the White House. And if enough of you make that call, it will happen. If you don't make the call, there will be a backroom deal. There is a backroom deal being constructed now, which will preclude any amendments being brought, certainly by the Democratic side, when the bill comes to the floor. Now, if you want to know more details about that, I'm happy to share them. The reasoning is very obvious. I think it's a serious miscalculation, personally, that the Democratic leadership feels that if they were to confront the big banks on this basis, on the basis of the Brown-Kaufman very clear up or down vote, that this would upset significant donors to the Democratic Party, and this would jeopardize the chances of the Democratic Party in November. I actually don't agree with that. I'm also going to call, we haven't done this yet, but we'll also call for everyone who feels strongly about this issue to send a $2 bill to any elected representative who chooses and announces they'll give up $2 of contribution from the banking sector, from the mega banks. The $2 bill has, you may not have seen one recently, it has Thomas Jefferson on it. Thomas Jefferson warned about the dangers of financial aristocracy. Thomas Jefferson had a big debate with Alexander Hamilton at the beginning of the Republic about economic and social structure and what was needed in terms of policy. I have to say, on most of the economic issues, Hamilton was right, Hamilton prevailed, and we built an economy and society very much along the lines proposed by Alexander Hamilton. But Jefferson had a huge point that he was right on. He said that this structure will result in concentrated financial power, and this will challenge the democracy. And that's what happened under Jackson, and that's what happened under Theodore Roosevelt. And that's what FDR, by the way, fixed. I think Theodore Roosevelt did a good job on the non-financial sector, on monopolies. He did not fix the power of the financial sector. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. And it stayed fixed for nearly 50 years. And that's what you need to do again. You can't fix it for all time. This is a problem I think that will come back. This is an innovative, fast-moving economy with a very inclusive political system. Look, it's a great country. It's a country that lets people with an accent like me speak about issues like this, go around the Capitol Hill having meetings with senators, talking about the ideas in a book like this. It's fantastic. There's no other country I'm aware of ever that's had this kind of political system. But it also lets you get rich and powerful very quickly and to use that to buy favor and to buy advantage and to use and put that back into making more money. And no one has done that more effectively in the history of the Republic than the modern financial sector. So, finally, or the final thought is, we need Theodore Roosevelt. We need political leadership. We need someone who'll step up and take this on. And I like Senator Sherrod Brown, and I like Senator Ted Kaufman, and I hope that you will support them, and I hope that you will help them create a Theodore Roosevelt moment. I don't know if they can do it. I think the odds are against them, honestly. I think it's up to you. I think if you feel frustrated, annoyed, concerned, you should take seriously what I've said. You should look at the book or go look at the free stuff on the website. You should decide for yourselves. This is an opportunity to force a confrontation and to do it in a productive and responsible manner. I'm the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. I'm not a crazy radical of left or right. I'm someone who's worked on economic crisis for 20 years. I am telling you what I think the IMF would tell you if it could speak truth to authority in the United States, which it cannot. But it's up to you. It's a democracy. That's what it means, right? People change their minds because of what Theodore Roosevelt did and the way he explained it to them. The consensus shifted. You are the consensus. Hopefully you'll change your minds today. If you don't, hopefully you'll change your mind tomorrow. Hopefully you'll change your minds before we have another awful financial crisis. But it's really up to you. Thank you.
Okay, as is our convention, we'll have questions. There are 2 mics. The mics will be handed out in advance of the question, so make sure you keep your eye on me and the mic person so that we get the mic to you. First one right here in the front. One right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Nani Burns. I'm actually a former regulator. I was the Commissioner of Insurance here in Massachusetts. I think I follow your blog all the time. I agree with your re-regulation and what we need to do, but I think we have also allowed ourselves to be captured by this mindset. When you say it's Jamie Dimon's job to make money for his shareholders, that's what Lloyd Blankfein does, that's true, but there is a larger constituency for these big entities, and that's the community at large. It's not okay for them to make money on the backs of poor people, middle-class people, sell them mortgages that they can't pay back. And it's so beyond the fact of the lack of political will, which does actually seem to be changing a little bit, that we need to get other people to think differently about that and say it's not okay for them just to make this much money, no matter how they do it, and change the sort of intellectual framework for how we think of these entities. And I don't know whether you have any more.
Look, I think these are very good points, and this gets to the issue of ethics and our view of ethics in modern society. So, and I think that the SEC Goldman case is very interesting, partly because of the discussion about John Paulson. So even people who have great reservations about the system have said to me, John Paulson didn't do anything wrong. But take your point, take your analogy, and think about it. John Paulson was constructing structures, persuading Goldman, according to the SEC, and other news reports, to construct structures that, if they went in his favor, would result in massive losses for people on the other side of it, and great losses actually for taxpayers. And I think that the people running the system are incredibly smart, all right? And they know there's an incentive issue within Goldman that they're playing off, and some failures of risk management. And they know that the people on the other side of this deal are the IKBs, which is a German bank with serious governance issues, and ABN AMRO with its own issues, it turns out. And it's exactly as you said. This is, if people want to make money in Vegas gambling, I have no problem with that. If hedge funds want to make money gambling actually on speculative activities that don't have a knock-on effect, and we can convince ourselves of that, well, yeah, so then I'm fine. Yeah, we have to worry about it. This world is very complex, particularly world with derivatives. It's very hard to know where the damage is, and there should be a presumption, I think. The presumption should be, you've got to show me that this is a safe thing for you to bet, for you to do, for you to bet on. So I have a problem with what John Paulson did, and I have a problem with that line of business existing. Even though I'm not saying that he violated any laws, and I wouldn't also not claim that he violated his ethical code or the ethical code that we teach in serious universities, but maybe we should just change that ethical code.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points I had wanted to make was to reinforce the one that was just made now. When you say that someone who performs their job well, and several times you said that, is satisfying all the ethical requirements that are there on him, I think that's a misunderstanding. Someone who is a good mafia boss performs his job well. That does not mean that he satisfies ethical requirements. So professional responsibility to a profession as it's defined by its function is not the standard for ethics or morality. And the idea of taking into account broader notions of what ethics are into your professional role, so it's limited by that, I think is an important idea. And I think it was brought out well by the previous speaker. So I just want to reinforce that. My question, as someone who is not well-versed in economics, I'm an ethicist, I'm a philosopher. Last week, we had, 2 weeks ago, Professor Reid come to speak to us. And he spoke about how the government had been captured by lobbyists on account of the fact that there were no more large individual conglomerates who had complete power over their area of the economy. Rather, as a result of deregulation, there had been many, many small companies competing with each other, and they needed to provide money in order to get an edge in the market because they were too small to control it. This was a theory of a certain sort of capture by lobbyists of the government because of breakdown of large companies. Now we're hearing from you that capture has taken place because there are enormous concentrations of wealth and they're too big to fail. So from someone who has no expertise in this area, I would like to know whether both these theories are consistent with each other or whether there is a division of opinion about what leads to government capture. Because from my hearing, right, at least at a superficial level, these seem to be, to some degree, different views about what leads to government capture. My additional question as a naive person on the economy is, why did Obama bring back into the administration the very people who created the problem? And indeed, according to a Frontline report on PBS, silenced the head of a component of the Clinton administration that was in charge of overseeing financial regulation. I can't remember the name of the woman.
Brooksley Bourne.
That's right. That she was presented as something of a heroine, as a Cassandra, right? They deliberately silenced her. They tried to publicly humiliate her. Why did he bring back the same cast of characters, Rubin's protégés?
Well, the third question is the easiest.
Let me just say, if you have questions, you please put your hand up so I can get you the mic.
The third question is the easiest. You have to ask President Obama that. I have no idea. Okay. The first question is actually something I wanted to argue with. I wanted to find an ethicist to ask myself. To have this kind of discussion. But the mafia boss example is not quite good enough, because the mafia boss is presumably breaking the law, right? Now we need to find situations where people are obeying the law, obeying the rules, complying with what the regulators say. They may be co-opting the regulators; they're not corrupting them; they're co-opting them, and I like this. I like the previous questioner, the way she framed it, which was, there are negative spillovers. We're responsible to some degree for our externalities, right? We tell our kids to, not throw trash around, and partly because you get fined for littering, but mostly because we think it's a bad thing to do. So I think that's having a code on those dimensions will be really encouraging. I have to tell you, I was at a discussion recently between a senior retired banker and some very young and up-and-coming finance types. I'm not going to disclose where it was. It was most disconcerting because the 65, 70-year-old banker was saying, compensation's out of line and people should not get paid these mega salaries because they're always taking massive amounts of risk that can be damaging to the firm and more broadly. And these young people who are very smart were disagreeing completely. They said, no, it's a market. Right? This is what we've told people. It's a market. It's got rules. We're obeying the rules. And if the guy makes this much money for the firm, he should get, some big chunk of it. Right? So I think that this is a huge issue that we should all be writing and arguing about. But I hope you give me a better example afterwards than the mafia boss. And what I missed out, because I was thinking about the mafia boss, I missed the point. What does Robert Reich say that we don't say? What's the difference in the view of capture?
I don't think the conflict is quite as sharp as you're setting it up. It's
theory. That's what I'd like to know.
Well, what's his view?
So the account in supercapitalism is that there's been increasing competition in the economy that makes it such that businesses need more aggressively to try to rent seek to distinguish themselves from other businesses. But one area of competition is the competition we as financial investors engage in trying to pick the best place to place our money. So that's actually consistent with it being a concentrated industry that we're competing among, we as investors. So there's not a direct conflict there, but it is interesting to think about.
I think these things are complementary. I think, within the financial sector, there's plenty of competition. Goldman and JP Morgan cut each other's throats on a commercial basis routinely. So I don't think it's not a collusion. And I can see Robert's point that if that kind of competition increases, I want to turn the rules in my favor vis-a-vis other firms. But the big capture is for the financial sector versus the rest of the economy, right? It's the intermediate. They're producing an intermediate good. They've actually tilted the playing field towards this intermediate good, away from people who produce both raw materials and final products. So our story is a sectoral story. His story is a story within sectors.
So that was Francis Cowan. Please say who you are when you ask your question, Bud.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Arnold Relman. I'm an emeritus professor of medicine who's long been interested in ethical issues relating to how the market affects medical care. With all due respect for the really very insightful and very instructive analysis that you've given of this situation, of which I know very little, I would like to call you on what appears to me to be your willingness to go where the market takes you without considering the ethical consequences. I would like to suggest that maybe there is a basic problem here with how we educate our bright young minds who are going into economics and business. Last year, some students at the Harvard Business School drew up a statement, an oath, which they compare to the Hippocratic Oath, saying good things like, I'm going to run business in an ethical way, not just that I won't break the law, but I'm going to be concerned about the effect of my business decisions on the community and on society, and I'm not going to do anything that's bad for society. Now that oath was offered on a voluntary basis to the entire Harvard Business School graduating class. And to my utter astonishment, less than half of the class chose to sign it. Now, my question to you is, does that represent some failure of education at the Harvard Business School and throughout the academic economic sector, of which you are obviously a very influential part? It seems to me, or it's a question that I put to you, is the love of money so dominating, and is the idea that when the market speaks, we all must follow, unless it breaks the law. If it doesn't break the law, do what the market tells you to do, and money is the objective, the overriding objective of life. Is that attitude something that could be changed by education?
Okay, I think it's a good question. It's a very fair question. I'm not going to comment on Harvard Business School. I think that's better dealt with by Harvard professors. I would, if I speak about MIT, I think this is something we need to address. We recognize it. We are trying to address it. I think that the broader question is really very interesting. I don't think, for myself, I don't think making money is the most important thing in life. And I'm not sure for these bankers it is necessarily either. And I think we should recognize that having a money-making component of our lives and having variations within society. So it's actually, a group of people who are entrepreneurs, I think who I work with closely, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, they are, for the most part, not generally motivated by, I want to make, $20 billion. They're generally motivated by, I want to build something, I want to create something new, I want to have a fulfilling job. Now, in order to make that work, they have to raise money. They have to get it from someone else, typically. That's how venture capital works. They have to make money for their investors. Actually, they have a responsibility, I think, when they raise money for investors, responsibility to treat them fairly. And I think some degree of using money as a metric, which is very much Alexander Hamilton's tradition, is fine and appropriate. Now, the question is, where do you draw the line? And if it's about you go out and you capture the people who are regulating you, that can't be okay, right? If you set out to do that. What if you build things, I worry a lot about, if you build things that are so complex you don't understand the consequences. I think a lot of these people didn't actually realize, I know a lot of these people, they didn't actually realize that the complex products could damage society. Now they realize it more, they're not inclined to stop, which is a little bit of a different issue. But it's also very hard to show it, to prove it. You can't mathematically write down saying the following structure of transactions will necessarily result in this loss for society or this loss for relatively poor people in society at this moment in time. It's a rather more chaotic structure than that, right? So these are very interesting and important and good questions. Our book, I would say certainly, is not an anti-business book, and it's not an anti-finance book. It's saying we created a system that's really profoundly dangerous and it should be fixed, and we're not going to fix it. That's our priority. Reduce this level of danger. I think going beyond that, though, there are these questions, all three of these questions are very good questions. But what should we do further about our value system, and what should we teach in our business schools and in our schools of government? There's no question we should do a better job on encouraging people to recognize and seek out and think about the externalities they're generating, how what they're going to do is going to impact other people in ways that aren't measured. And for them to try and deal with that. And I must say, a lot of MIT students, just speaking about MIT, are much more concerned now than they were 10 years ago about social responsibility, social impact, sustainability, the rest of the world, relatively poor people.
What about the 40-some-odd% of Harvard graduates who went into finance?
Well, I think that when you see that amount of talent going into one sector, particularly the finance sector, it's a warning sign. It's a danger sign. But I don't fault them at an individual level. I think that's what they're brought up to believe, that the market will give you a good signal. And Michael Lewis's book was very entertaining, and not a bad thing to do for a few years. And then maybe they make some money, they can pay off the loans, and then they can go do good work around the world.
Bill Gates.
As a counterexample. Didn't graduate.
My name is Sofina Qureshi. I'm actually a student at the business school here. I had a question about executive compensation. One of the things that has been pushed further and further is the idea of increasing the amount of long-term equity that's in CEO compensation and senior level compensation as a way to better tie management to the company to think in a long-term way. And one of the concerns is that no one was longer Lehman Brothers shares than Dick Fold, and yet it did not really seem to encourage or change behavior. So I'm wondering what your views are in terms of executive compensation, how to think about that in terms of risk management and managing a company.
I think you just answered your own question. Dick Fold is the perfect answer to the question. I think regulating compensation may have a role to play, and certainly it makes sense, even from a shareholder perspective. I think I would like the people running the company, given the enormous agency problems you have with these very complex modern corporations, I would like them to have the same sort of incentive, same sort of payoff structure as I have. Right? So I'd like them to have a longer-term payoff structure. But the real problem is the incentive to take risk. Right? And the upside, what do these people feel they get on the upside? A lot of money, a lot of, bragging rights. And what do they get on the downside? The last banker to be executed in the Anglo-American system, we did check this, is in 1836. There was a banker called Fauntleroy who was executed in the United Kingdom for fraud committed when he was covering up that his bank was about to fail. I am not proposing we go back to executing bankers. I think we did well to leave that behind us. But there's a fundamental problem in any of these structures, which is the downside risk is always capped. Limited liability is a good idea. This was a big and sensible innovation in the 19th century, not just here, but across other countries that did well. That's a fundamental principle behind getting lots of capital together and doing big projects like building railroads and canals. But any limited liability structure that your downside is capped, you can get a lot of upside, the downside is capped, and particularly if you're a too big to fail structure, and if you can get, I'm not kidding, what these 13 bankers got was, to our serious calculation, the most generous bailout in the history of humankind. Honestly. Even Rick Wagoner, the head of General Motors, was fired as a condition of their loan, right? Remember that? Can you find me the statute that authorizes the government to fire the head of General Motors? I don't think it exists. I think the conversation is, would you guys like a loan to save your sorry selves from immediate bankruptcy? Oh, you would? Well, here's a few things we'd like to have before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning from your side, right? So this administration knows this. They know power. They know plenty about business. They felt they couldn't get rid of a single one of these guys. All their boards of directors. That's incredibly dangerous. This is the heart of the problem. Compensation, I think, is much more of a, the doctor may correct me, but much more of a symptom than the underlying disease. I would rather treat the disease. We may also want to have address the symptoms, excessive compensation, excessive short-term compensation. But good luck with that. Good luck going to John Stumpf and suggesting he turn back some of those tens of millions of dollars he got in cash. It won't happen. It won't happen. The administration can't do it. President Obama couldn't do it. He asked them to be nice. He asked them to behave. He asked them not to take so much short-term compensation. They turned him down because they could.
I wanted to kind of ask another ethical question, but a different one.
Can you identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Reinhard Benjamin. I'm not affiliated with Harvard, but here anyway to see you. The question I wanted to ask was something about something we might call transparency or the principle of public reason more generally. One of the things that you say that I actually find most powerful is when you talk about, if you just told some person at the IMF about the situation in the U.S. and you covered up the name of the country, right, that you get very different answers out of that institution. And I tend to think that that's true more generally. And for me, I think it seems very threatening that it's much easier for me to get kind of frank information about political economy and the choices that are being made in other countries that are having crises than it has been for me to get clear information of high quality about this one, especially when it was kind of unfolding. It's very easy to figure out what Thailand should be doing, what Thailand should have done, or Korea, than it was to access some kind of clear technical consensus about the choices that should have been made. So I wanted to kind of press you on that point and see how you think it's going. I feel like as this has unfolded, I've had to do a lot more digging to try and figure out what the choices are on the table and what everyone should be rooting for in the case of the U.S. than it has been in emerging markets.
Well, that's an interesting question and set of points. I think I have two responses. First of all, I think our view of the United States, the view of many people, the view in the consensus, kind of changed over the past 50 years. And as I said, I had lunch with these emeritus professors from MIT today, and we had some discussion about when that changed. At some point, the mainstream consensus started to see the U.S. as less about politics, less about these deep power politics, obviously it's partisan politics, and much more about sort of being a technocratic professional type of society. We figure out good solutions, we have a bit of a debate, we kind of do the right thing. Instead of being, and the idea of regular state capture is quite strange to people. And when we use the word oligarchy, which just means concentrated political power coming from concentrated economic power, when we used it to describe the United States last year, a lot of people were absolutely horrified. But as you say, if you look at the characteristics of the country without thinking about the names, we have some aspects of other places where I've spent time and I've studied in detail, written papers, published papers on Thailand, Korea, for example, other parts of Latin America I've worked in, or even Russia. So I think that we should lose that illusion. We should lose the illusion that we've somehow progressed beyond, evolved beyond politics, or beyond the power struggle and the capture element. I think it's always been with us, and it always will be, and we should face up to that. It may be something that's easier for everyone to recognize in a country other than their own. You go to Thailand, it kind of strikes you in the face, right? Who's got power, who doesn't, and what that means. I think perhaps the problem everybody has about their own country. Now, on the other reaction I have is that the blogging, the blogosphere, I think is very helpful for your concern about how do you get informed analysis and opinion and options, because what it does is it shrinks the distance between experts and popular debate. So that experts, the experts in the sense of people you can, well-informed colleagues, you have lunch with them, you go to a seminar, they have a view, they might write an op-ed every 3 months, it might or might not get published. Sometimes, speaking of someone who's worked on the inside of policy circles, ideas thrown in at you from academics, sometimes are very influential, sometimes they come back and they matter 20 years later, and sometimes they're just 2 days too late to make a difference. And I think what blogging does, and what blogging has done for us, and what it does for lots of other people, it's not just about us. I think there's a strong community of people who are analytical, academic in a sense of not necessarily having official academic affiliation, but much more being people who really work hard on and drill down into a particular domain, and then can communicate that to other people. This community of people has very good discussions and a very good evaluation of policies and in real time, right? In ways that the mainstream media can do sometimes but doesn't always do for various reasons. I remember when Bank of America got a bailout in January 2009, I stayed up to see the term sheet, and I worked really hard for an hour and a half, and I wrote up a pretty trenchant critique of that term sheet. And I put it up on our website at 1:30 in the morning. It was actually on my birthday, so I remember it very clearly. And I thought, wow, it's really great to be at the forefront and be the first person. And then I checked my competitors. And wouldn't you know it, Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism beat me by 10 minutes. And then she had a slightly different view. But that's good, right? That's like rapid reaction by people who, have their own views, no doubt, but are pretty well informed, and you don't want to trust any one of them. You want to go out and, when I say to James, what's going on this issue? He says, let me check the blogs. And he'll tell you which his favorites are. And, you know quickly what various people are thinking. And if you follow them over time, you know who they are, you know what issues you trust their judgment on, and what other issues you'd rather look at someone else on. I think it's very helpful. And I think it really, to me, is complementary to the other things available in the media, and a very good thing going forward. And the comments on websites are also important. There's a very good blogger, Mike Consul, who certainly first came to our attention through the comments he posted on our website. And we let him run our website while we went on vacation last summer. He did a great job. His website rose in profile. He's hired by the Roosevelt Institute. I would say he's one of the leading bloggers on derivative-related issues. We cite him all the time now. So people can break in, people can rise up, expertise can be established, credibility can rise very quickly through this kind of structure. I think it's generally extremely positive. I would also say, by the way, there's an enormous amount of information jamming out there. I was recently almost had my identity stolen by a so-called AstroTurf group. And I have had conversations with I talked to them before I came in here. We're still negotiating exactly how we're going to sort this out. They, I think, under false pretenses, represented themselves as being from the progressive side of the discussion. I participated in a conference call with them. They put my picture and the transcript of the conference call on their website. They then started running ads that are very narrow corporate interest ads in, for example, Nevada against Senator Harry Reid. I told them immediately to take down the image and the material they had related to us, to remove all links to our website. And we have actually come up with a counter ad to their ad. So it tries to explain to people that one thing that happens is you get interest groups out there that pose as representing certain views when that's not actually what they're about. And this, I think, goes very much to Larry's interest, because these people do not have to tell you or tell anyone who is paying for their campaign. That's a huge problem, right? I think you want to, your transparency point, if we knew who was, and I said to them actually, I said to them, look, let's have, and then the guy agreed just before I came out. I said, let's have a debate. Let's have an open debate. You can come represent your view. I'll represent my view. Honestly, I think both of us will have to answer questions about who's behind us and who funds us and who doesn't. But let's debate on the substance. Why are we skulking around the so-called, AstroTurf campaigns where an organization like DCI, for example, is well known to manufacture things that look like grassroots campaigns? That's not reasonable. That's not a good basis for democracy. That's cheating. That's not ethical. I have a big problem with that. And I think we should I think this democracy needs more free, open, and fair debate. And I'm happy to debate any banker, any of these leading bankers. If they don't want to come out and debate me, I'll debate with their lawyers. If they don't want to send their lawyers, they can hire an actor. Whatever they want, okay? Come out and have the discussion. Don't just skulk around behind the lobbyists. Don't make it all backroom deals. That's, I think, a big ethical issue I would like to raise with you. The ethics of the politics behind all of this.
Okay, we have run out of time. Please join me in thanking Simon Johnson.